Putin doesn't hold all the cards, right? He has to play a game of counterbalance and responding. China has loosened its monetary policy for the first time in 14 years, for example, right? And you might wonder, well, what's that got to do with Russia? Quite a lot. A lot of questions here. And I think it's going to be as much about Putin's mentality as Zelensky's willingness to engage and Trump's ability to bring them together. Trump wanted to fully pull out of Syria and doesn't really care about the Kurds or, Russia's role or presence there. He's not interested. So we could see a significant reversal of fortunes in the next few months or even weeks, depending upon how fast the Trump cabinet moves. Israel has been taking out certain military assets, strategical sites, as a precautionary move to ensure that it is protected, it's protecting itself. And that it will withdraw from Syria in the coming days. I'm not as opposed to BRICS as I used to be, but I'm still relatively skeptical. It's a slow burner, right?
Piotr, it's great to see you today.
Hey, Jason. Always good to see you too.
Listen, there's a lot going on right now. We just saw Syria totally collapse, Assad fled. But more interesting yet is the fact that Russia didn't come to support its ally. It just let Assad's regime fall apart. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the word that is losing its value a little bit, but it's unprecedented, isn't it? Not only have we seen the collapse of a regime, a dynasty that has been in power for many decades, it took as many hours for it to collapse. And that is because, primarily, I think one could argue that Syria, Assad's main allies, supporters, backers, Russia and the Islamic Republic of Iran did nothing to come to the support of Bashar al-Assad. And whilst Iran, we can talk about that, in another way, Russia is arguably the more interesting case here, the more big deal, because it's supposedly a great power. And I think that that's point number one that people should really keep in mind, which is that this is an illustration that Russia doesn't have the ability to continue to project its great power across the region. We can talk about whether Russia's a great power because it has nuclear weapons, but as the country that we would assume is able to exercise and exert its influence across its near abroad in this region, without any competition. Turkey's powerful, Iran's powerful, but they're not Russia. And that's not the case. And Russia did little to basically nothing to stop the overthrow of Assad and what is now happening in Syria in remarkable circumstances. And the last point I would make on this very, very fluid dynamic situation is that we can see it was coming, because Putin was silent. And whenever Putin is silent, when he doesn't have anything to say, it's because he doesn't know what to say. He's out of his depth. And given Russia is all focused on Ukraine, Iran's all focused on Israel and its other proxies being decimated, this is a huge mess from the Kremlin, and it's sort of access partners being undermined. So it's a big deal, but how it's going to play into Ukraine and Putin's strategic thinking going forward is equally interesting.
But it is interesting. Just imagine this. We've seen in the recent period that Russia has not come to back up its allies. We saw this in the case of Armenia as well. Now, overall, do you think this is just showing that Putin doesn't have the capability to keep up a global empire? Or do you think he's just calculated? These countries aren't worth it. Where do you think this is in his worldview?
Yeah, no, it's a really fundamental question here. And we talk about it a lot on my channel. About you and I, we've talked about sort of what is Putin's calculus in these sorts of circumstances. We can all joke about Putin being a master strategist, but I'm very glad you brought up Armenia, because I think that's a great example. At the beginning of the year, we saw this remarkable, extraordinary events around Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan, which is heavily supported by Turkey, basically walking straight into Nagorno-Karabakh and making the 250,000 Armenians have to depart, to leave. And we can talk about the historical claims of both sides to that territory. But the point was, Russia did nothing to come to the aid of Armenia, which has historically always been more closer to Moscow. Azerbaijan is a bit more complicated. But there's a particular also reason for this, which is that Armenia didn't just say, can you help us? They activated the security clause in the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, which is what Russia sort of created after the Warsaw Pact and the end of the Soviet Union. It's not very big. There's only about 6-7 members, but it was an illustration that Russia basically just didn't have the bandwidth, and they didn't follow through. And Putin, despite what he claims about Russia being able to go toe to toe with the Americans or the Chinese in certain ways, other than nuclear numbers in terms of rocket warheads, which are a very context specific sort of set of weapons, right? Russia's not doesn't have that, and I think Putin is very much out of his depth. He is seeing things go badly for him. He's spending what 140, $50 billion of his economy on war related stuff. And that's bad because it doesn't seep into supply side economics. There's no greater benefit from this in the long term because all that stuff is destroyed or damaged or something, right? So he's putting the Russian economy into an overheating phase, and I generally just think he is struggling. I don't think we should deny that not things are challenging for the Ukrainians as well. But with the Trump administration coming in and sort of signaling that maybe Trump's more open than we thought to sort of supporting Ukraine if Putin doesn't play his cards right, this could be a huge, even bigger setback for the Kremlin. But what are you seeing at the moment?
No, I absolutely agree with you. And I think actually the loss of Syria shows that it was a weakness on the side of Russia. The fact is they are not able to defend their allies because we can see the impact of this. Losing the bases that Russia had in Syria will affect Russia's ability to project strength, not only in the Mediterranean, but throughout Africa. Remember, just in the recent period, Russia has backed coups in multiple African countries, including Burkina Faso, as well as Mali, as well as Niger. Now, how will they possibly be able to get supplies and get troops down to those republics to back them if they don't have the facility in Syria? But more than that, as you observed, the Russian economy is overheating. The inflation rate realistically is above 28%. We see additionally that the oil prices are likely to go down in the near term, especially due to the United States, which under Trump is likely to start exporting oil in much bigger numbers. So if the Russian national budget is based on $72 per barrel to be able to have a balanced budget, and oil prices go down, Russia runs deficits. So if Russia were to see oil prices go down to, let's imagine, $50 per barrel, well, it's been calculated. That would mean Russia would have to devalue the ruble to about 135 to 155 per dollar. So imagine this. You have inflation of 28% on one side, devaluation of 35 to 55% on the other side. It means the Russian currency is becoming more and more worthless, which is why I think that BRICS and the dream of having a common currency is totally insane and unreal. Do you think they could actually achieve that?
Well, before I address that, I did want to just echo what you said about Africa, because as someone, I lived there for, a good couple of years, and I've seen on the ground the vying competition between the great powers, China really building up the BRI or Belt and Road Initiative. But Russia's a really interesting case because, again, they don't have that bandwidth to go toe to toe in an absolute approach as sort of China does economically, or America does militarily or diplomatically or whatever culturally. And the way that we've seen this playing out in the Sahel, particularly with the disaster around Wagner Group, right? If people remember, the French pulled out and the Malian government requested and agreed that the Wagner Group would come through. But the Wagner Group have ended up actually being quite badly beaten by some of the warlords and the Islamic jihads in the Sahel in Mali. And it's a huge embarrassment for the Kremlin, which they don't really like to draw too much attention to. And the loss of Syria as that transit is hugely important. And also from an optic perspective, right? Always in the UN, whatever we think of the value of the UN, optically in international relations, right? Syria would always vote on the side of Russia, no matter what it is. And they've lost that ally. They've lost that symbolism that they do have friends out there. And this brings us to BRICS, right? Putin hosted BRICS in Moscow, a few weeks ago. And that's a great sort of signal to people that Russia is still relevant. It's still here, and it has friends and partners around the world. But aside from what it does in terms of just shaking hands and patting backs, the actual policies that the BRICS are suggesting, which I think is more China and company, because China's more than 45% of the actual structure of the BRICS and supplies of things to the development bank that they've built, is it's very limited. Right? The reason a common currency like, say, the euro works is because it's in a geographically confined area. How are you going to make a currency that works easily, a physical currency, a fiat currency between, say, Brazil, India, China? It's not that easy. And whilst we can talk about the rapprochement, the reconciliation of relations between India and China, for example, the two are still tense. There are still competing security concerns, even with Russia and China. if you remember that map that the Chinese brought out in August of 2023, they even claimed, it was very minute, but it was still a territorial claim to a part of Russia. So there are areas here that are obviously lingering, and the Kremlin knows. Putin made reference to a couple of years ago, right? He's hoped that the issues over the southeastern border with China could be addressed, peacefully and diplomatically, right? So Russia is aware of these territorial potential disputes, and so I think BRICS, whilst on paper it has a lot of potential, we are seeing those headwinds constantly creep up, and why, aside from words and things happening at a snail's pace, they're never really building into something really, really substantive. So I'm not as opposed to BRICS as I used to be, but I'm still relatively skeptical. It's a slow burner, right? Would you agree?
No, I agree. I think that, in fact, it's going to be very hard for BRICS to become more than just a club. If we look at the countries and each one of their individual interests, it wouldn't really make sense. What they export to each other and import from each other, it really wouldn't benefit from having a common currency. Moreover, the largest country, the most important country, China, is already said that they're not very interested in getting engaged with a common currency.
Mm.
Now, just think about it. China itself wants to be able to protect its economy. And China is a country that does the vast majority of its trade with the West or with Western allies in Asia. It's far less interested in having closer economic ties with, let's say, Russia, which is only about 2% of the imports and exports that it has, than it is with its traditional partners in the West and its partners in Asia. So, looking ahead, though, I'd be curious what you think of the situation for Turkey today in light of what's gone down in Syria. How does this change the dynamics, and what role did Turkey play in what's happening today?
Well, I think it's without question that Turkey is the biggest beneficiary from the events in Syria. I made a video just on this yesterday about the situation in Turkey's perspective. You know, the rebels actually approached Ankara about 6 months before the developments in late November, asking them and suggesting, we're planning this. And whilst Turkey hasn't been directly supportive, we know their relationship with the Syrian National Army, or SNA, which is one of the bigger groups in northwestern Syria, and have been sort of supporting Turkey in its sort of buffer zone activities in its military incursion in 2019, which it held for a couple of years. But they weren't directly involved with this. It was more like a tacit blessing. So Turkey benefits from this probably most of all. We can talk about other countries which sort of relatively win or lose, but Turkey by far wins out here. And, keep in mind that Turkey has a very unique relationship with the Middle East. A lot of the Arab states, I believe, have reasonable relations with Turkey, but they're quite sort of distant. Turkey wants to, I think, to be seen, or Erdogan more specifically wants to be seen as someone who can bring the Arab world together, the Muslim world together. And it's always been somewhat rejected by other regional powers like Saudi Arabia or Egypt. Turkey floated the idea of being one of the peace forces in sort of Gaza, for example, early on into Israel's campaign there. And it was firmly rejected by many other regional powers. So Turkey wants to sort of have this leverage, but it hasn't always been accepted. As for BRICS in Turkey's context, keep in mind, the bigger an organization gets, the more bloated it becomes, because you have to consider more people's perspectives. There's more bureaucracy, all that sort of stuff. And it don't necessarily think it's going to benefit Turkey completely. Turkey also has to play a balancing act here of being part of NATO. It is a disproportionately important part of the NATO alliance. It's the second biggest standing army. But also geographically, right? It has the strait which it controls, and generally has been critical in the grain deal with Ukraine and Russia, and well, just as a sort of one of the more non-Western parts of the security alliance in NATO. So Turkey has a lot of fingers and a lot of pies, but Erdogan does a good job of hedging. And I think that Turkey can benefit from this. I think the biggest test will come about the Kurds and what happens with the US perspective of the Kurds. Trump's made some comments about that as well, if I believe. But what do you think about that?
I agree with you totally. I think that Turkey is probably one of the most interesting countries to be watching today. They're very active. They have a huge capability. And what they are doing now shows that they are leaders, not only in the region, but global leaders, because everybody else calls on them. The United States calls on them. The Chinese deal with them. The Russians call on them. They play a central role. So I think they're a global player, though what they are executing seems to be regional. It's actually much broader. But let's also talk about other countries in the region. What does this all mean for Israel? And how do you take it that Israel immediately acted to start destroying various terrorist structures within Syria after the fall of Assad?
So Israel is an interesting one. I think it's one of the relative countries that has benefited from this in the sense that it didn't really like Bashar al-Assad. However, it doesn't necessarily also like the insurgents, the HTS and rebel coalition that have taken over. It depends, I think, what those groups do, and from what we're seeing, they're allowing Syrian refugees to come back in. They are already trying to ask rebel entities to pull out from certain areas and for police forces, security services to take over in that regard. So it does look good on paper, but we're only the second, third day in, right? So it depends. But what Israel is doing from their perspective is building up their security. They have taken over the mountaintop. I forget the name of it at the moment, but they've secured a significant bigger part of the territory beyond the Golan Heights, which they have occupied for many a decade at this point, at least internationally recognized as such. And they have tried to build up more of a, I would say, buffer zone in that regard. And I think what is one of the more problematic or controversial aspects for many people is that they are arbitrarily striking into Syria against what they deem to be potentially strategic and risk areas. So these are chemical plants. One suggests that it was chemical weapons, which obviously we remember 10, 11 years ago when there were claims that Syria did use chemical weapons against its civilians. So Israel has been taking out certain military assets, strategical sites, as a precautionary move to ensure that it is protected, it's protecting itself, and that it will withdraw from Syria in the coming days. But as we've seen in the case of Lebanon and Gaza, a lot of skepticism remains about the extent to which Israel is going to conduct itself vis-a-vis international law. And whether or not it could overstretch in some of its policies. Now, I know this is an incredibly sensitive and controversial situation, so I'm trying to balance objective analysis with, avoiding sort of being too critical. But I think there is a lot of wariness of what Israel will be doing in the coming days. But Netanyahu has made it clear that he intends to protect Israeli citizens from what is now a third front Israel has to sort of manage or at least monitor. Aside from obviously Lebanon, Hezbollah has been decapitated largely, and Hamas still lingers in bits and pieces in Gaza. So Israel is drawn across multiple fronts, and I think a large proportion of it will happen dependent upon what happens with the rebels. But equally, to bring in last point, Turkey. The Turkish-Israeli relationship here is going to be important. And it's going to be a difficult one because Netanyahu has not exactly not been receiving a lot of criticism from Erdogan. So how to get those two to somehow engage and therefore extend into diplomatic relations between the two is going to be challenging, but interesting to watch. What about you?
Well, it's definitely going to be very interesting to watch. But what I think is another dynamic here, which you alluded to earlier, was the fact that nobody's quite sure what Donald Trump entering the equation means. Now, we know he's very supportive of Israel, and that's clear. We also know from what he's written publicly that he was not sad to see Assad go. But I think was really interesting was to see how he commented about Russia's weakness
Mm.
and Russia's inability to defend its ally Assad. So when you see that, how do you think that Putin perceives the fact that Trump has said things that were borderline of insulting, that Putin had made a bad deal, that he got into Syria and didn't know what he was doing? Even more, Trump has said that he's going to put a 100% tariff on goods coming from the BRICS countries. I don't know how somebody in the Kremlin could interpret this to be a sign that Donald Trump is interested in cozying up or become better friends with the BRICS countries. What's your analysis?
Wow, it's such a revelation, right? We've had this conversation, the two of us, on my show as well, and I think what's really interesting is I don't know if it would be a U-turn, but significant pivot in a lot of Trump's rhetoric. Now, it is just rhetoric, right? It's just words, but still, Trump does often like to speak his mind and what he intends to do. And I think his foreign policy is governed by transactionality, right? He wants something if he's going to give something. And his comments around Assad, I don't think come as too much a surprise. But most of us, I think, would have assumed that Trump wanted to fully pull out of Syria and doesn't really care about the Kurds or, Russia's role or presence there. He's not interested. Had these developments in Syria not really happened, then you could argue that probably his comments might not have been as notable. But because of this seismic shifts in the past 12, 13 days, this is obviously something that plays into his calculus. Some of the people he's putting in around him, his advisors, are also illustrative of that, I think. But when it comes to BRICS as well, every country is interrelated in some way. Russia may be ostracized by the West, heavily sanctioned, but they're very dependent on China, and China's, well, heavily invested and integrated with the US economy. So if Trump's going to sanction, well, or at least put tariffs on the BRICS and including China, that by default is going to affect Russia. So it's a domino effect. So that is something that I think the Kremlin is going to still be concerned about, particularly during this period of overheating. It is the winter period. It's never easy in parts of Russia and the north, particularly during a full-scale war, which is not exactly going well for the Kremlin. So I think Putin's going to be extremely wary of these comments, and even more wary by the photo op, that Trump had with Macron and Zelensky in Paris. It's notable that Trump was wearing a yellow tie and a blue suit, and I have to admit that I did share an image on my own social media, which was where the photo was heavily enhanced to make it look like Trump was wearing a lighter blue suit to sort of indicate or symbolize the Ukrainian flag. It wasn't that bright. It was a dark navy blue suit. But the point is, some of the comments that Trump made around Zelensky indicates to me that he is maybe not softening, but certainly considering more the Ukrainian perspective, plight even, and what was once the potential of a complete and utter withdrawal of support for Ukraine entirely, or even defunding of NATO, is very much not likely at the moment. And I think doubling the tariffs, right? It's going to be a double whammy effect. You've got doubling of the tariffs on China, on BRICS. That's going to affect Russia, which is going to be a negative feedback loop. And then you've got the positive feedback loop where Trump continues to support Ukraine. So we could see a significant reversal of fortunes in the next few months or even weeks, depending upon how fast the Trump cabinet moves. But it's there's so much going on, as you said. So how do you see this playing out?
No, I agree with you. It seems that Trump is getting a heavy dose of anti-Putin at the moment. On one side, he already had his predisposition to not love Iran. He's always been against the government of Iran. And certainly, the Israeli government is trying to encourage that. But then you look at who he's spoken to recently. Not only did he meet with Zelensky in the United States a few months ago, but he met with him again at Notre Dame in Paris. He met with Macron, who's also not a friend of Putin's. But then he also met with the Prime Minister of Armenia.
Yes.
So it looks like he's getting a lot of information that's saying Vladimir Putin is not our friend. So I think that bodes well for us. And the more that the United States realizes that Russia's war in Ukraine is actually just an element of a global war against the West as a whole, not about Ukraine. It's never been about Ukraine. Ukraine is a battle, but a very important battle, but a battle in a global war that Russia is fighting. So how do you think the collapse of Syria will affect Russia's war in Ukraine?
Well, it's almost sort of potentially there's a few factors. You could argue on the one hand, Jason, that actually it's almost like Putin doesn't have to worry about it, right? We've lost it. Okay, it's over. It's done. Let's move on. Just focus on Ukraine. It's one less front to have as a headache for Putin. And I think this is indicative because Assad obviously has been granted asylum, but he still hasn't been able to meet Putin. And I think that's quite interesting. Putin clearly doesn't see Assad as that important anymore. He's expendable. He's useless, frankly, let's be honest. But it is very problematic for Russia in a few ways, but the most notable that comes to mind at the moment, because it's still in a complete state of flux, are the two bases in Western Syria. We've touched upon the importance of the naval base and the air base for Russia's activities in Africa, but it's the Mediterranean as well. Currently, the Russian vessels are docked outside of Syria, right? They haven't gone down to Libya, as some people suggest. They may still do that, but basically they are in a limbo. They can't use the port or don't want to risk angering the rebels and want to obviously play a diplomatic soft power game, try and keep those ports or the bases. But right now, that means they're in the middle of the ocean. Well, that's not exactly great for maintenance. It's not great for usage, operations. Not that the Navy plays necessarily the biggest role in Russia's campaign in Ukraine, but it's still a massive headache and requires attention, energy, resources to manage. And also, just generally, Russia, if it doesn't have the ability to exert its influence or presence, at least in Eastern Med, that is a huge problem for its sort of how it plays into the Black Sea. And then obviously Turkey and Russia have this competitively cooperative relationship, which basically means that they operate in similar theaters, have sort of interests at times, but also conflicts, right? Russia's jet was shot down by Turkey in the Syrian war about, 6, 7 years ago. So this is obviously a problem for Russia in the context of Turkey's control of the Bosphorus Strait, access to the Black Sea, even beyond the how many vessels that Russia's lost at the hands of Ukraine's remarkable maritime strategies over the full-scale war. So this is a huge problem for Putin. Syria maybe wasn't necessarily a direct resource for Russia's campaign. But again, it was this counterbalancing, it was this optics, it was the ability for Russia to feel that it had friends. And this trickles also down into Iran for one particular reason, which is Iran is a huge supplier of drones and other equipment, military resources to Russia. And with the loss of Syria and its access to the Shia Crescent, which is an incredibly important part of the Middle East for the Islamic Republic, that trickles down and affects the Kremlin, because they don't have a Iran which is as confident, as stable to go about doing this. So it all connects. And I think Putin's going to be seriously on the back foot here, trying to see how he can manage the economy, manage his relations with the new government or leadership in Syria, the strategical situation in the Eastern Med and therefore Turkey, and so much more, let alone a Trump administration coming in and potentially bolstering NATO. Right. And we've got a German election coming up. What could that do to a reinvigorated NATO leadership and EU? Lots here to cover in the coming weeks.
No, there's definitely a lot going on. And the fact is, there's a lot of things we simply don't know yet. But from as far as I can tell, things are getting worse and worse for Putin on the economic front and on the military front. And I always think it is funny that the press talks so much about Russia making gains in Ukraine. The fact is, in the course of a year, to take 0.1% of Ukraine's territory, Russia lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers and expended incredible sums of money, just billions upon billions, where the Russian population is becoming more and more impoverished. Though all the statistics that you would see publicly shown say that Russia's economy is growing, it lies the fact that inflation is actually much higher, and those numbers are false. And as you've said, how does Russia possibly keep spending so much money on a military? But let's just imagine if the war were to end tomorrow. What does Russia now do? What's the basis of their economy? Where's the engine if it doesn't have the massive military production that it currently has? So looking ahead, where do you think this is going? Do you think that Russia is going to continue to lose different parts of its global empire, of its global influence? Or do you think it's going to be able to pull it together somehow?
I think it really depends on what happens in Ukraine, Jason. It's so much is dependent on Trump because of that overarching role the United States has. But I think it's clear Putin doesn't hold all the cards, right? He has to play a game of counterbalance and responding. China has loosened its monetary policy for the first time in 14 years, for example, right? And you might wonder, well, what's that got to do with Russia? Quite a lot. Russia's dependency, reliance on the Chinese economy for its support. Russia has established a drone base, a drone facility, which I also covered on my channel, in China with support of Chinese military intelligence. We're so used to the Soviets, the Russians providing that in military intelligence to the Chinese, but now it's the other way around. So the point is that China's making economic adjustments as well. And all of this trickles down into a Russian economy, which is in a severely fragile state. We can talk about whether it's on the verge of collapse, and that's always something that I think is a possibility, but it's also can sometimes be over preached. But definitely Putin is facing some economic headwinds. At the end of the day, if you don't have an economy, then you don't really have an ability to fund a war. And so Putin, I think, will definitely be keen to see some kind of deal or some kind of negotiations beginning with Zelensky. The problem with that is that the Russians are 100% maximalist. They want all their requests, demands acknowledged and agreed upon by Kiev. And that seems incredibly unlikely, even though Zelensky has suggested that he's open to talks now. No, so I think that depending upon if Trump is overzealous, or Putin is overzealous, then he will be on the back foot. Because Trump will punish him through more sanctions, increased aid to Ukraine. So I think this is going to heavily depend on Putin's overextension and doubling down with existing relations that he feels he can only rely on, North Korea and China. and possibly Iran, depending upon how they manage themselves in light of Syria. But it's certainly not looking good for Russia. A very easy time moving forward.
It certainly doesn't look very good for Russia at this point, and its allies are all suffering for their own reasons. But I don't see anyone coming to save the day for Vladimir Putin. The fact is, he's overextended. And Russia, by building this global empire, has decided to take on incredible costs to maintain it. And when it comes push or shove, we see that Russia is not able to back it up with either money or with military might. And it's going to get harder and harder. So when you look at what Zelensky has said recently, where he is interested in having talks with Russia, and we've heard that the Russians have said that, but of course, they take a hardline position that they want to have a understanding there'd be no NATO expansion, that they would immediately receive 5 of the oblasts of Ukraine. Do you think that this is something that's realistic, or do you think that Russia is willing to negotiate for a better bargain, a lower deal, because knowing that there's no way they will get all their demands met, especially now that they've showed such incredible weakness globally? Everybody sees that Vladimir Putin's words don't match his actions. He can't back them up. What do you see?
I see a situation where Putin, particularly at the helm of Russia, has a habit of speaking very, in zero-sum game terms, in absolutist terms. But actually, sometimes there may be some minor adjustments here and there. We can see this playing out in Syria now. Russia knows it doesn't have the winning hand right now. It has to play the diplomatic game. It can't use military force to get what it wants. Might is not right in this case. Hard power will not be useful in the case of Syria. So it's having to play games. It's having to play the diplomatic card to ensure that it can try and keep those bases. I think that Putin will, despite what he makes clear about rhetoric about, Ukraine losing all of the 4 oblasts and Crimea, it's not going to be the case when it actually comes to talks. That's at the end of the day what talks are for, and why I've always been frustrated that people think Trump can actually secure 24 hours a peace deal. It takes we haven't even begun talks yet, let alone somehow reach some settlement. And I think both sides are going to be very difficult and begrudging in sense of trying to make concessions, but I do think there will become some form of concessions. I don't think Trump will be pushing for Ukraine to be in NATO to the same extent the Biden administration has. Sure, the Europeans are more about that, but in that case, maybe there'll be a compromise. Ukraine can be fast-tracked into joining the EU, and they receive more funding, because at the end of the day, Ukraine needs a lot of economic funding to rebuild, to restructure its economy. And NATO isn't necessarily the primary fact for that. The European Union under Macron also, there's a lot of push for a European army. So could we maybe see a push for that through the European stream? And therefore NATO is less of a priority for Ukraine, as long as they get that sense of security assurances to prevent Russia from being able to invade their territory again. It's that sort of details that might be more important. But the difficulties over the territories, Crimea is a sticking point for both, I think will be incredibly challenging. So I don't think any talks, were they to begin next year, would be over quickly. I think fighting would probably continue, and you might not even get a deal. You might just get a frozen conflict or a DMZ. In a video I made, we discussed the idea of a demilitarized zone and why it's one of Trump's suggestions, and it sounds good on paper, but why it might not actually be that practically realistic, given it's 3.5 times the size of the DMZ and the Korean Peninsula. So a lot of questions here, and I think it's going to be as much about Putin's mentality as Zelensky's willingness to engage and Trump's ability to bring them together. At the end of the day, Trump wants to see this as a win, a photo op. I don't think he has too much care for Ukraine. He may be more open to its cause now, but maybe because he can see this from a benefit to America, because at the end of the day, his approach is America first. So I think there's a lot here to understand, and it's all going to rest on those 3 as much as just Putin.
Absolutely. Piotr, listen, it's really great talking to you today. Let's do it again sometime soon.
Can't wait, Jason. Always a pleasure. Speak soon.